Looks like it's time for us to start. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. This is the presentation on race and labor in historical and contemporary contexts. My name is Dwayne Schaefer. I will serve as your moderator, and I am the president of the National Council for Higher Ed, which is the higher ed arm of NEA. With that said, I would like to introduce our panelists. This will be in the order that they will be presenting to you today. Bill Fletcher Jr. is the author and activist, former president of Trans Africa Forum, and senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies. Darren Moten, Alabama State University, co-president of the Alabama State University Faculty Staff Alliance, and a vice president of the Alabama AFL-CIO. And then, of course, definitely not least, Sherry Ann Butterfield, Executive Vice Chancellor and Associate Professor, Sociology, Office of the Chancellor, Rutgers University in Newark. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Bill is going to start this off, and then we will go to Darren and then Sherry Ann. Bill, the floor is yours.
And I very much appreciate it. Thanks, Dwayne. And I want to thank the sponsors of this program, the National Center, and thank you, the viewers and participants for joining us today. So I have this task, which at first, I think it really hit me a few minutes ago, because I have to introduce this question of race and labor in historical and contemporary context. And I have about 20 to 25 minutes to cover more or less 500 years. So this becomes a major challenge, so wish me the best. What I want to do is I want to make some points about the historical context and then bring it up to today, and basically 4 points about the contemporary moment. And I want to start, as I frequently do when I discuss race, by making what some people think initially is an outrageous statement, which is that there were no white people on planet Earth before 1492. Now, you may think that I was smoking something before this program started, but I wasn't. In fact, I know that there were a lot of Europeans before 1492, but there weren't any white people. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the construction of race as we understand it and have understood it for about 500 years really starts to shift in the late 1400s into the 1500s. That prior to that, there were references to race in a very generic way. Different tribal groups, ethnicities, etc., might have referred to each other as races. But the thing that we've come to think of as race, certainly in our lifetimes, is something that is relatively recent in human history and was something that was actually constructed. And the construction can be rooted primarily in 2 major historic moments. One was the completion of the Reconquista in Spain, and the second was the British conquest of Ireland in the 1500s. And so I want to start there to set the stage, that when Columbus went to Isabel and Ferdinand seeking finance for his trips, he was confronted by them with the following, that they were willing to support him, but he had to hold on for a second because there was something that needed to be taken care of. Now, when most of us were growing up, we weren't quite sure what that something was, if you even knew about that. But it was just in passing. But what that something was very significant. It was the completion of the Reconquista. That is, it was the completion of the reconquest of Spain, what became known as Spain, by the Christian kings and queens, largely based in Castile and Aragon. And they eliminated in 1492 the last of the Moorish kingdoms, which was Granada. And the Moors were, of course, the people from North Africa, Arabs and Berbers particularly, who had controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years, beginning in the 700s when they crossed over. And in fact, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after the Moorish general who led the invasion into Spain. So Isabel and Ferdinand were in a process of eliminating the Moors, but also eliminating the Jews. So the Reconquista was not just about eliminating the Moors from Spain, but it was also about clearing out non-Christians. But it was not just non-Christians, because with Isabel and Ferdinand arises this notion of the purity of the blood, which in many ways is an oxymoron, because if Spain was controlled by Moors for 700 years, it's kind of difficult to imagine that the blood is going to be that pure, right? But ideologically, Isabel and Ferdinand framed it as the purity of the blood. And this notion of the purity of the blood and la raza, the race, not the way Chicanos used it in the 60s and 70s, but la raza, the traditional way, was the elevation of this notion of a race, a grouping of people that were somehow superior to all others, which the Spanish and the Portuguese, in one form or another, take to the Western Hemisphere when they begin the invasion later in 1492. The second element of the construction of race is when the English subjugate Ireland, which they do in the mid-1500s. It completes a 200-year process of conquering Ireland that began with conquering the area around Dublin. And the English, in conquering Ireland, carry out a very different process than the merger with Scotland. They carry out the complete and total subjugation of the indigenous Irish people, the elimination of their ruling class, the elimination of the ability of the Irish to speak their own languages, the bringing in of settlers, particularly from Scotland and Wales and England, to have the best lands in Ireland and pushing the indigenous people off of their lands and tending to push them south. Now, when the British do this, they accompany it with an ideological notion of racial superiority. And they postulate a superiority over the indigenous Irish. And the British didn't mean this in descriptive sense. They meant it. They meant that their conception was the superiority of the English compared to the Irish. And the Irish were treated as an inferior race. So much so that over years, and as recently when I visited Ireland in 1988, there was a term that as an African American I found very strange: anti-Irish racism, not anti-Irish discrimination, not anti-Irish bigotry, but anti-Irish racism. This was very difficult as an African American to conceptualize, because I was thinking about racism as related to issues of color and et cetera. But what the Irish experience showed is that racism does not need color. Color is one possible way that racism can play itself out. And I'm talking about Ireland. I'm not talking about Irish Americans and discrimination that they face. That's a whole different category. So the modern construction of race, as we've understood it, really emerges through this. Then what is added to that is the invasion of the Western Hemisphere, the genocide that's committed against the indigenous people, along with the African slave trade. And it's in that context that what's added to race and racism is color. And that becomes critical for us to understand what plays itself out in the Western Hemisphere and what it is that we have been living with. So then, what is race and racism? Race, there's only one race on this planet. That's a human race, Homo sapiens. The origin of all Homo sapiens is Africa. In fact, the origin of all humanity is Africa, and in Southern and Eastern Africa. So in that sense, all of humanity are African. Hands down, science, that's it, no more discussion. But politically, there have been constructed these so-called races, all to accompany the invasion of the Western Hemisphere and the expansion of European colonialism around the world. And those races don't have any scientific basis, but they have a political foundation. And they have operated, the notion of race is the materialization of a differential in treatment between populations to the advantage of an elite, right? So race is not about how you think. It's not about bad behavior and who you like. Race is about a differential in treatment that is introduced, that is forced upon populations by an elite in order to accomplish its objectives, which include, it might be the super exploitation of a particular population, case in point, Africans, but also issues of social control over the entirety of the laboring classes. If we had more time, I could get into that a great deal more. In North America, with the English invasion, the emphasis there is in bringing settlers over to the Western Hemisphere and the establishment of a settler state. The 13 colonies were a settler state set up by the English with no intention to develop any kind of collaborative relationship with the indigenous people. The objective was to expel the indigenous people from the land, to either do that violently, annihilating them, or simply continue to push them further and further west. So when people talk about, it's frequent that people will talk about the original sin of the United States is slavery. That's half true. The original sins of the United States are the establishment of a settler state and the genocide committed against the indigenous people, along with the ultimate enslavement of Africans. And when I say ultimate, it's because of this, that when the elite established these colonies on the East Coast in beginning of 1607, they forced labor to come to the 13 colonies in order to carry out work. In that sense, the labor movement starts shortly after these forced laborers come here, because the labor movement becomes a struggle of laboring people against gross injustice. The forced labor was a combination of Europeans, many times prisoners, but not always, who were forced to come here, and Africans who were forced to come here. And the majority of the Africans in the beginning of the 1600s that came here came as indentured servants. Some came as slaves. Now, what's interesting about that is that it meant that the Africans, although forced to come here, because we didn't come here voluntarily, forced to come here, after 7 years could obtain freedom. But what the English elite realized fairly quickly into the 1600s was that all of these indentured servants and slaves were frequently joining together in what I would call a labor movement against the elite. And there were constant rebellions in the 1600s. And the English had to identify a mechanism in order to ensure social control. And they essentially took what they had crafted in Ireland and brought it to North America, adding on to the issue of color, and ultimately changing indentured servitude for Africans into total slavery for Africans, racial slavery, slavery for life, and for the life of one's child. And that differential set the stage for US history, along with the expulsion and the annihilation of millions of Native Americans. So the labor movement, I would argue, first begins shortly after the colonists arrive and when they bring forced labor. And then it is formed, and then I would argue is deformed. Because after the US becomes independent of Britain, there is still this very central notion that the US is being constructed as a white republic. And for much of the early history of the United States, that was central to the notion of the United States and of its citizens. And that becomes very relevant when we look at right-wing populists today in terms of what they see as a critical image. So you have the beginning of a white republic where certain people, certain Europeans are defined as white. Not all Europeans were defined as white. In fact, what happened was there was a probationary system for Europeans before they could be considered white. Irish, for example, were not initially considered white. Jews, Italians, and others were not initially considered white. And one way to think about it is that think about going to a doctor's office, and you go to the doctor's office and you go into the waiting room and you wait for an appointment. And so you're not out in the hall, but you're in the waiting room. And then maybe the doctor will see you at some point. Well, the US had a waiting room. It was a probationary place where the term was questionable whiteness. Europeans were in a particular state until they could be, until they proved themselves to be worthy of being considered white. The labor movement that I have been talking about that becomes deformed and splits along racial lines, by the 1830s, you start to see the development of a trade union movement, a movement that starts to resemble what we know now as unions. And in the interest of time, I can't go into all of this right now, but what I will say is that the fact that this movement develops within the context of a white republic and is itself a white movement prior to the Civil War has very much influenced the consciousness and vision of the movement as a whole. That to a great extent, much of organized labor sees itself as flowing out of a white trade union movement, to which the rest of us are add-ons. And that is historically inaccurate, but ideologically it's very, very powerful. Now, in the interest of time, I said I want to jump to today. So today, organized labor, the trade union movement, remains in a dramatic state of crisis, a crisis that I would argue began in the late 1940s, but really picked up in the 1970s. It has a problem of self-conception in terms of what its objectives are. It is still largely shaped by a paradigm established by Samuel Gompers in the late 1800s, which articulated that the role of unions was to fight for wages, hours, and working conditions. It was called pure and simple trade unionism, or bread and butter trade unionism. But it was not a social justice unionism. It was not a vision of a transformation of class relations. It was not about targeting all and every form of oppression. It was fairly narrow, and our movement is still trapped largely within that paradigm. Thus, there's a disconnect from social justice. Some unions engage, others do not. Sometimes it's temporary, other times there's an attempt to go long term. And within this crisis, there is a fragmentation, as there is a lack of a strategic vision about where organized labor should be going. While corporate America is kicking our rear end, there's still within organized labor leaders that cannot come to grips with the fact that there needs to be a fundamental transformation of trade unionism in order for workers to have any level of justice. Now, what about race? Race has evolved considerably over the years, and what has happened in time is that there's been a reconfiguration of who is considered what so-called races. European groups, there were many European groups that were classified as races before 1924, including Jews, Italians, Slavs, etc. And they were put in that category of questionable whiteness. They weren't Black, they weren't Asian, they weren't Latin, but they were called questionably white. And if you read many primary source material from pre-1924, you'll see very interesting references to people becoming white. It's like, I grew up in New York. I mean, white people were white people. They didn't become white. They were white. That's what I was told when I was growing up. But no, it turns out that there was a whole process of becoming white. And that was, again, proving oneself worthy of the title, which could include going west and killing Indians and settling land. participating and supporting slavery, supporting Jim Crow segregation, engaging in genocidal wars like the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1910. So race evolved, and over time, various European populations that had been treated as suspect races were brought into the white bloc. But not only was there transformation among Europeans, among non-Europeans. So after 1848, Mexicans were brought into the United States as a result of the war of aggression against Mexico. And according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they were supposed to be considered white, because if they were considered Black, they could be made slaves. If they were Indians, they could be annihilated or put on reservations. But they were never treated as whites. They were always treated in a status that was very analogous to that of African Americans, and their land was regularly stolen. They were subject to various kinds of brutality and vigilante so-called justice. So they became racialized. Arabs begin moving to the United States in the early 1900s, more or less. And to a great extent, they were treated as whites until September 11th, 2001. And then by September 12th, all of a sudden, Arabs realized that they were no longer white. Various Asians have been racialized as they came over here. Intense antipathy towards Chinese, and other Asian groups, including their expulsion from the United States in some cases. And then you have other Latinos, including Puerto Ricans, who were colonial subjects brought in when the US launched its war against Spain. There has been a constant attempt by the elite to redefine the white bloc, and I'm running out of time, so forgive me. And this white bloc has been critical to social control, because the white bloc, whiteness has become a uniform that white people, whether they're rich, poor, or whatever, are to put on, and allegedly builds an alliance between the poorest of the whites and the richest of the whites. But what it basically says is, you as a so-called white person, you have a chance of becoming rich if you align yourself with the elite. We're not going to guarantee you'll become rich, but you'll have a chance. But here's the other part. No matter how bad things get for you, there'll always be someone beneath you, one of the racialized groups. And this has been central to the relative stability of US capitalism. My final point is this, that this is all relevant today because the racial settler state origins of the United States haunt us in the form of right-wing populism and neo-fascism. And what the forces that have aligned themselves with Donald Trump understand is that this image of the US as a white republic is something that is deeply rooted in the consciousness of millions of white people. And that all one needs to do is to push a few buttons and that consciousness becomes activated, such as suggesting that Mexicans bring crime, such as suggesting that all Muslims are terrorists, such as ignoring that the most dangerous, feared criminal organization in the United States is the Russian mafia, and not anything from Mexico, Central America, Africa, or Asia. All of that is part of the racial button. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. In some places, good morning. That's others. I bring you greetings from Montgomery, Alabama. I want to thank Dwayne, Sherry Ann, and Bill. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. My talk this morning is going to talk about the history of labor organizing on historically Black colleges and universities. I teach at Alabama State University. My home is Montgomery, Alabama. That's the location of Alabama State University. we're one of 7 historically Black schools in the state of Alabama. We're one of 2 public supported HBCUs. Our sister institution is Alabama A&M in Normal, Alabama, which is north of Montgomery. And so this history is the history of organizing on historically Black colleges is really a history of Black folks organizing in the labor movement. It's parallel to that effort. Because of feudal peonage and big mule politics in the South, particularly in the wake of Reconstruction, state legislatures across the Deep South passed bills that made it difficult for people to achieve fair wages, made it difficult for people to work in safe working environments. And this was true for poor white laborers as well as Black laborers. Alabama passed a right to work law in 1953. However, in 1921, Alabama passed an anti-boycott law. And so in 1956, when Dr. King and about 99 other boycott leaders were arrested, or I should say they were arraigned by a grand jury. They weren't really arrested. They went down, they voluntarily turned themselves in. They were held as having violated the 1921 anti-boycott law. That anti-boycott law was an anti-strike law. It was a law that made it illegal for 2 or more persons to conspire to boycott a business or a place of employment. And so, as historian Wayne Flint, I'm someone who is pretty popular here in Alabama, formerly taught at Auburn University, wrote that Democratic Redeemers in 1875 fixed their attention on low taxes, banishing labor unions, and bolstering cheap labor, including the nefarious convict lease system. And so this is the history of labor agitation and labor organizing in Alabama. I don't think that history is unique to our state. And so it is also, I would argue, the history of Blacks trying to organize at historically Black colleges. Currently, there are about 103 HBCUs. Most of those campuses are located in the South. Many are located in the so-called former Confederate states. And so most began as normal schools or teacher training institutions. And Alabama State began as a teacher's school, and for a very long time, we were the largest public supported HBCU teachers college. We're probably number 2 right now. Talladega College, which is north of Alabama, where of course the Talladega speed race is held, was the first American college for Blacks authorized to confer baccalaureate degrees. Alabama A&M, of course, is one of our land grants, an ag school, with Tuskegee and Auburn University are the other two ag schools in our state. HBCUs are not an anachronism. Howard, which is my alma mater, produced more African-American PhDs, lawyers, architects than many other institutions. HBCUs do the lion's share of educating Blacks and only receive a fraction of federal and state funding. With a history of underfunding, underdevelopment, and neglect, historically Black colleges and universities would appear to be fertile grounds for union organizing, but sadly, the opposite is actually true. Howard began or became the first historically Black college or university to unionize its teaching corps, and the first to affiliate with the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT. AFT chartered Howard University's Teachers Union, Local Number 33 in 1918, in November of 1918. The first meeting of Local 33 was held in Founders Library. I'm a graduate of Howard University and very familiar with that campus. Among its charter members included Mary Church Terrell, a noted African-American clubwoman, and the first president of the National Association for Colored Women. Local 33 disbanded in 1921. We don't have many documents, sadly, that detail the history of that local, but it was a very important local, if for no other reason, that it was the first Black school and the first Black school for AFT to form a union. Howard formed another chapter in 1930, formed a chapter, of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, in 1933. Dr. Lane Locke, the father of the New Negro movement, became its president. It joined or affiliated with the AFT, becoming a joint affiliate. It became Local 440, counted among its members Dr. Sterling Brown, whom I remember as an undergraduate student who was retired and still held an office on Howard's campus when I was there. Like Local 33, Local 440 pushed AFT to invade racism on different levels. One example occurred in February 1938 when it joined fellow unionists, the United Federal Workers, the American Women's Trade Union League, the AFT Local 27, and the Workers' Alliance of America in objecting to the reshowing of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation at a local DC theater. Another example were two resolutions that were introduced on the floor at the 23rd annual meeting of the Buffalo, New York meeting for AFT in September 1939. Resolution number 50 urged AFT to denounce racial segregation and specific acts of discrimination against Marian Anderson and Negro people in Washington, D.C. You may recall that the Daughters of the American Revolution, or otherwise known as DAR, refused to allow Anderson to perform at Constitutional Hall. The contralto performed before 75,000 from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday as a fundraiser for Howard University School of Music. Another resolution, Resolution 52, decried the denial of equal opportunity for Negro students forced to attend schools in inferior buildings and were subject to shorter school terms and who had no birth services. And I might add the lack of Black high schools. From my point of view, one of the most insidious aspects of racial segregation in the South, or particularly as it relates to education, was the lack of Black high schools. You may know this history already, but there were a number of historically Black schools that had laboratory high schools or laboratory schools on their campus. That is, Alabama State at one time had a laboratory high school, which was considered, and this again was not unique to Alabama State, one of the best high schools in the state of Alabama. And why wouldn't it be? It had college or faculty teaching the classes in that school. So the Local 440 also put a resolution on the floor decrying segregation based on race, creed, or color. It urged AFT to endorse the principle announced in the Supreme Court's Gaines v. Missouri decision. And as you know, this was one of the decisions that led to sort of the building blocks for Brown v. Board in 1954. And finally, the same resolution asked AFT to aid state teachers associations working to block unequal educational opportunities from the face of our democracy. Across the street from my campus is the Alabama State Teachers Association. At the before, and Dwayne, you would know this, before the ASTA merged with NEA, becoming part of the Alabama Education Association. The Alabama State Teachers Association was the largest Black teachers association in the South. And as I said, the headquarters for that building is literally right across the street from our campus. Currently, AAUP and the American Association, AAUP represents 5 HBCUs: Delaware State, Edwin Waters College, Central State University, and Wilberforce University, and Lincoln University. AFT and NEA jointly represent Florida A&M. The 1980 Supreme Court ruling in Yeshiva, the National Labor Review Board versus Yeshiva, precludes private HBCUs from forming a union. When the NLRB approved in 2002 the right for LeMoyne-Owen College, a HBCU affiliated with the Church of Christ. LeMoyne-Owen is located in Memphis, Tennessee. The faculty and staff sought to unionize because of the firing of several faculty members and staff without due process. However, a federal court overturned the NLRB's decision in 2004, thwarting LeMoyne-Owen's faculty's chances to unionize. In her book, American Work, Jacqueline Jones writes that jobs are not just jobs. They are social markers of real symbolic value. Racial stigmas abound. However, old Jim Crow is dead, but his progeny haunts boardrooms, courtrooms, classrooms, and emergency rooms throughout America. In Plessy v. Ferguson, Chief Justice Henry Billings Brown opined, if the two races are to meet upon terms of social equality, it must be the result of natural affinities, begging the question, how do we as a nation foster natural affinities? And to steal a line from Bill's talk, benign neglect is never benign. And Bill, I am reminded of something that Governor George Wallace said in his inaugural address in 1963. Many people remember him talking about segregation today, tomorrow, forever. But before he said that, he said this. George Wallace said that he was a proud son of the Anglo-Saxon Southland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. That was wonderful. Good afternoon, Sherry Ann Butterfield from Rutgers Newark. I first want to thank my co-panelists, Bill, Darren, and Dwayne, and also the organizers of this conference, both Bill Herbert and Michelle Savarese, for really getting us together and putting us in this space. I originally was going to talk about labor and higher education, and the more I thought about my role as a sociologist and in the higher ed administrator, I decided to shift my remarks a bit today to talking about what higher education is being called to do right now, and that is to educate and facilitate the learning of the next generation of social change agents, leaders, and laborers. At Rutgers Newark, we have 22 unions, and in the ways in which we have come together as a community, we're seeking to change the lives of our students by making them a more informed and active citizenry who will hopefully alter the landscape of organized labor, right? And so as a scholar who works on race, I thought I would use my own institution, Rutgers University Newark, as a case study of what happens when one considers the entire ecosystem of race and labor. The importance of place, space, social institutions, systems of oppression, and what happens when one tries to make real and substantive change. As my students range in age from 16 to 65, many of them have been laboring in search of better opportunities for themselves and for their families for decades, generations, and 400 years, right? And the fact that Rutgers Newark has no racial majority makes it a perfect place to study the impact of historical and contemporary issues of race and labor. As our nation takes the 10 first steps on the long road to recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, we face daunting realities. So we have COVID, we have racial reckoning, though we've been needing to face our racial reckoning for centuries at this point, but now it's the time. Merely staying afloat has required record investment, right? And so how do we rebuild our economy sustainably? And it's going to require much more labor, much more thought, much more social justice. When Bill was talking about how unions were historically not thought about as social justice engines, they have to be now, right? Because it's required for the generation that comes behind us. We must grapple with the ways in which the pandemic and this moment, our newest moment of civil rights, has thrown into sharp relief our states and nations' underlying structural inequities that stymied social mobility long before COVID hit, right? And so recent research shows the disparities that have been growing most alarmingly in our cities. I'm coming from Newark, New Jersey, extremely urbanized space, right? As America has relentlessly urbanized and our nation's demographic diversity has exploded, what we call the elevator of social mobility, and once America prided itself, has now broken down. It's always been broken, but new people now have figured out that it's been broken, right? And so I'm thinking about what Bill was talking about in terms of how things were constructed for the benefits of whites, but not for others. American higher education has in many respects contributed to those inequities as both the widely acknowledged lever for social mobility in a globalized knowledge economy, and yet is strikingly unrepresentative of the demographic and class diversity of our younger and future generations. Prominent thought leaders like Raj Chetty and Tony Carnevale and colleagues have documented compellingly higher education's map of social inequity. And we've known this. What do we do about it? And so one of the things why I wanted to make Rutgers Newark a case study is that it's not your typical university. And I'm not just saying that because I worked there, but it's doing this work long before I got there and digging in right now. It's perennially regarded for having one of the nation's most diverse student bodies, and we've really worked hard to gain proficiency in fostering social mobility because we are so diverse, right? We've leaned hard into our mission to leverage our diversity, creating a network of initiatives grounded in cutting edge scholarships that really shows diverse communities, both the students, faculty, and staff, compared to homogeneous ones, generate better, smarter solutions to complex problems, what many call a diversity bonus. We've embraced the challenge to aggressively transform our structures and practices to cultivate the diverse talent we have in abundance with an eye toward modeling best practices. Our goal is really to move away from traditional models of public service, and I'm doing public service in quotes, in which faculty and students do things for a passive and needy public, as public historian Scott Peters has put it, and instead engage in a public work that taps and engages and develops the civic agency, talents, and capacities of everyone, inside and outside of the academy. Our strategic initiatives in these areas already range from cross-disciplinary initiatives rooted in community to partnerships with diverse communities of experts to create co-created spaces in the city and the region. Throughout, we seek to pool the expertise and energies of our staff, our faculty, and our students with those of partners from across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, which always should have been at work, but we can talk about that a little bit later. And really using the institution to put your money where your mouth is. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Looking at our diverse community in Newark and Northern New Jersey, which is one of the most ethnically diverse regions of the nation, we see structural inequities up close. Rutgers Newark is a federally recognized Hispanic serving institution. And people are always like, really, in Newark? Yes. It's located in a state with one of the highest college attainment rates in the US at 46%. We are in and of a city that is 85% African-American and Latinx, but yet where the college attainment rate is 21.5%. Now, Newark is far from unique in this way. We can get any major city and talk about the disparate numbers. And yet its commitment as a city and a network of anchor institutions gives us a realistic possibility of change that if changing that map for inequity and serving as a national model. We have what we call the New York City of Learning Collaborative, which Rutgers serves as a backbone organization and is engaged with numerous higher ed institutions in the region, corporations like Prudential and Audible, cultural anchors like New Jersey Performing Arts Center, the Newark Museum, and the Newark Public Library, and mounted citywide, not college knowledge workshops, while also providing opportunities for adult learners to get additional credit, right? At the same time, we are engaged in a partnership with the city to what we call hire, buy, live in Newark. And so the ways in which we are digging into the city in which we reside, which higher ed traditionally, historically has always had a problem with. Many of our students, and as we know from the success stories of our students of all ages, 35% of whom are first generation go to college, 57%, almost 58 are low income, Pell eligible, coming from Newark and all over New Jersey, and indeed the nation. It's important to smooth the pathway to college and career can and does work, and that their talent is uncontested when given the opportunity. And again, this is at all spaces. So we have our students and we have our staff that we're also trying to give opportunity to, and hiring from Newark. When we first talked about people like, what do you want to, that's what we should be doing. That is our responsibility to the labor that has gone on for decades in the city. We are equally aware that generally making good on higher education's value proposition as an engine of social mobility in an era of record inequality entails assuring access and affordability on a scale never before been confronted. And I know there's another panel on student access, right? But really thinking about what does it require of us right now, particularly for the changing demographic that we have. So we are convinced, and we have results to back this up, that with strategic, substantial, and substantive investment in the talent cultivation of the diverse populace living in Newark and throughout New Jersey and our nation, we can reap the diversity bonus like institutions have not done up until this point, or at least on a larger scale. We can do this by scaling up all that we're doing now, building pathways to college like those mounted by what I talked about a little while ago, the New York State of Learning Collaborative, our Center for Pre-College Programs, a Run to the Top program that provides full last-in scholarship for all Newark residents and county college transfers with an adjusted family income of $60,000 or less. Connecting pathways from county colleges where we know the vast majority of first-generation students first touch higher education. Supporting areas like STEM, supporting the full needs of our students with supports from what we call the Student Affairs Care Team to our food pantry. We know insecurity has always been an issue for college students, and finally, nationally, it's getting the attention. What does that require from us? And how do we organize ourselves to do that? Also addressing low-cost access to textbooks throughout our library and bookstore, and then connecting students to leadership training, social capital networks, and career exposure via partnership with national nonprofits. Having our students work in these spaces and places has been transformational. And again, I just want to our students are not traditional age students. I mean, we have a lot of those. So when we talk about the ways in which we have organized current labor in different spaces and really thinking about how we move that needle forward. We have the opportunity to demonstrate that when higher education teams up with an entire ecosystem of what we call stackable institutions across the educational continuum from K through 12, I feel like my second job is working with the Newark Public School System and working with the teachers there, to community colleges, to universities throughout the corporate and governmental sectors, supported by critical nonprofits in the arts and cultural sphere and in community-based neighborhood organizations, then the amazing talent of our diverse generation can indeed shine through. We know it works, we've seen it work. And so the question is, how do we continue to scale up and replicate it in other places? One of our most successful demonstrations of just how well this ecosystem can work is that we've created what is seen as what we call a revolutionary residential honors living learning community. Dedicated to local citizenship in a global world, we call it HLC for short, recruits a highly diverse student body on the basis of their social justice leadership potential, with 61% being from Newark, 76% Pell eligible, 46% first generation, and 30% coming as transfers from county colleges in New Jersey. These students bring the fresh, authentic knowledge of their lived experience, including but not limited to living with the fears of being from an undocumented family, having been in prison, representing faith communities often shunned as outsiders, aging out of foster homes, and raising families of their own. They're succeeding spectacularly. And that is they're majoring in every one of our schools and graduating and moving on to promising careers. But the ecosystem of all of those institutions and the ecosystem within Rutgers Newark is critical to that process. We could not do that without all of the folks who are employed at the institution and the ways in which we partner up with other institutions, other anchor institutions in the city. So now is the time for us to build on these successes and reach even further into a diverse talent pool that is really in our own backyard. We've sought to increase enrollment of Newark residents very intentionally. When we talk about the importance of race, when we think about the rebellion in Newark in '67, when we think about the takeover of parts of our university in '69, because we were sitting in the middle of a Black city and not letting those students in, we have some work to do in responding to that. Part of the university is built on former Black residents' homes. There is a responsibility to the city in which we reside. And so while there's still much work to be done, we've increased undergraduate enrollment of Newark students by 104% since 2013, while increasing undergraduate enrollment overall and trying to remain accessible and affordable, because we know that race, and not in all ways, but in lots of ways, are tied to social class and social mobility. So what else do we need to be doing? We have multiplied avenues of support for undocumented students. So we have a Dreamers organization. We created a Undocu Rutgers recruiting series in order to recruit students. Many of them end up coming to us and said, we have nowhere else to go. And you all openly welcome us without asking for lots of documentation that they just cannot provide. And so we have law school clinics, we have legal clinics, And we've also advocated to open state-funded tag to Dreamers and to make driver's license available to undocumented individuals. Extremely proud of that. And the other piece that we're proud of as we think about what it means to labor, we are also the administrative home for the New Jersey Scholarship and Transformative Education in Prisons program. We call it NJ-STEP for short. We've worked to expand its resource base by garnering state funds for it for the first time, as well as from external foundations, and advocated for the program's inclusion in the federal Second Chance Pell pilot program. NJ-STEP coordinates coursework inside of 6 of the 10 accessible state prison facilities and supports a transition to bachelor's level work at a university. Among the 34 NJ-STEP students who have graduated so far from Rutgers Newark are individuals such as Ron Pierce, who has emerged as one of New Jersey's leading voices for voting rights reform through his work with our partner organization, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. So we talk about organizing different kinds of labor. There's trade unions, and then there are others, right? And so what will continued success require? And I'm saying continued sort of because elections need to work the way they need to work. So a lot of this work can continue. Through this network of initiatives, we've begun to understand what it will take to achieve genuine inclusion locally and globally. We throw race out, and one of the things that Bill said about using race as a cloak has become, a uniform for people to put on, right? How do we take the uniform off? And so really, what else does it require institutions of higher ed to do? One of the important lessons that I try to remind folks, and this has come up in other spaces, so I'm definitely not the only one, is that as we look to educate our extraordinarily diverse generation of talented students, they are not extraordinary. And it's not because they're not amazing, but they're not rare, they're not unicorn, exceptional students. Just like we're not exceptional staff, we're not exceptional faculty. What we know is that they are much more talent where they came from. How do we cultivate that? How are we looking for that? And it is incumbent upon us to do that. And so as we do this as a university ecosystem, and then beyond that, in terms of social institutions, how do we have a greater investment? Because we need a greater investment in every node of the network we've built to cultivate the talent, to fulfill that, to achieve full potential, and to rebuild the elevator of social mobility for all people, not just a subset. This requires investments to scale up all the pieces of our collaborative ecosystems I mentioned, supporting infrastructure, supporting financial aid, thinking about pathways from community college to universities, thinking about living learning environments, thinking about the full range of social support systems on campus, and for climbing the ladder of our stackable institutional partners through experiences with nonprofits, corporate, and not, that provide careers and job opportunities for amazingly talented next generation leaders coming to and through Rutgers Newark. Now we know institutions of higher ed and Rutgers Newark have to directly address issues of race and equity and labor while being an anchor institution within a larger university context. And in my case, I'm within a city that is making significant positive change, but still dealing with some major challenges. And just want to be clear, this is incredibly rewarding work, but it is also difficult and challenging work. It requires culture changes both in and outside the institution that we all know all too well often takes years, if not decades, to accomplish. And in the space that has both folks who are unionized, who are not, administration, partnerships with other organizations, how do we do this where everyone is respected and everyone has a seat at the table, right? The truth is, though, we can't wait to move. We can't wait to move on the role of higher education and shaping the diverse communities in which we reside. Frankly, the stakes are just too high. The demographics of the nation have rapidly changed and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And we must educate our populace and ourselves, or we risk being left behind. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for their great presentations, as they definitely gave us a timeline of things to think about. I know our time looks like it's winding up, and some of our panelists have to have a dead stop, as they said to me. So I'm going to throw a question in and anybody can take it. And hopefully this will do some summation. Those of you who are in attendance, use the Q&A function and go ahead and put your questions there and we can respond to them later. If you don't mind, that will be a way of getting back to you. Also, Miss Sherry, I did get, that was a timer. I did get a question that someone would like to have a copy of your presentation. I don't know if you have that in written form and ready to present, but they felt that presentation will help them at their urban institution. So something to think about. My question is that as we talked about this timeline, we talked about race, and I'm glad Bill did say that we only have one human race. We're all Homo sapiens, and how this is a false construct. In this day and time, there is a discussion of anti-racists. There is a discussion of co-conspirators. There is a discussion of so much more. And I'm going to allow each one of you a minute to kind of respond to this language that is happening, this movement that is happening, this either repelling or attracting that is happening within our country. That's pretty broad, but take whatever piece that you want to respond to. Whomever likes to go first, go first.
Well, let me jump in because I actually do have to sign off. My apologies. I think right now the language of anti-racism is incredibly important, and I distinguish that from diversity. Diversity in its best light is about teaching tolerance. And I don't mean that sarcastically because we need greater tolerance in the society. But what we need more is a thorough understanding of racism and racist oppression. We have to understand the construct. And so anti-racism is not simply about how do people get along, it's really understanding the way the system operates and the need to take on a system. And that this is not primarily about changing individual behaviors, but it really is about changing the system. So I think that that's very important. And I think the other thing I would add to this, Dwayne, is that a lot of people talk about white allies. I'm interested in white comrades. So to me, John Brown was a white comrade. He wasn't an ally. He wasn't just sitting there waiting for us to say, well, now we need you to come in, white boy, right? It's like he was a comrade. He was there in the trenches. He put his life on the line. I think that there are people that fall into this sort of liberal kind of construct, and they sit back and say, well, we'll be an ally. No, we need you there on the front lines. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bill. And
Thank
Bill,
you.
you're excused. You can go ahead and leave. I know you got to go.
All right. All
Thank
right.
you
Thanks
so
very
much,
much.
though.
Take care then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye to everyone.
Darren, Sherry, who wants to go next? Our time is winding down.
Go ahead, Sherry.
I want to take up where Bill had to sign off, but one is to absolutely co-sign what he said about the between diversity and anti-racism, right? And so, but even more so about what allyship looks like. And so it's the trenches. It's sometimes, oftentimes, being in spaces that make you uncomfortable, right? And so when I hear folks like, oh, educate me, I really want to learn more about what it means to exist in this space as a Black person, not even a person of color. This is a Black person. And one of the things that I like to challenge some of my good people with is, what have you done to educate yourself? It is not a sense of me having to tell you what to read, what to do. What have you taken upon yourself? I will help you in this conversation, but what else are you doing besides asking for me to then extend more of myself and more of other folks of color space to help you through this process? And so really thinking about, it's not at the individual level. What are you willing to challenge? So when we talk about institutional change, are you willing to change how you receive your own benefits? Are you willing to think differently about who gets admitted into a school, who gets a job, and why that has happened? Are you willing to question your own privilege in a real way as opposed to just having a conversation? Because we're good at conversation. But what have you actively done? And I think for me and for the work that I do, I think that's the challenging piece of that right now. I'm co-teaching a class right now, which is why I have the hard stop on Black Lives Matter, and I'm co-teaching it with a white colleague, and she is amazing. And we see, we agree a lot, except that we then had a disagreement last week about the difference between systemic and institutional racism. And she did not realize, and I'm the race person, right? And she's like, oh, I never thought about them in different ways. But you have to be comfortable being challenged like that. And she was. But I mean, that's the kind of work for me that a true anti-racist will do. It was like, oh wow, I've been thinking about this wrong the entire time. What do I need to do differently now? I'll stop there.
Well, Doreen and Sherry Ann, I don't know if we can ever resolve this issue until so-called white people surrender being white. And I think we have to understand that there are meanings that we posit into these words, white and black. I ask my students, and I'm not trying to be silly here when I say this, but I ask my students, what makes Barack Obama black? Because, we would really have to make his mother an honorary black woman. And so, I understand that race is immutable in our society. Driving while black is real. And so, I get that. But there is a privilege, there is a power that people who think of themselves as white, who refer to themselves as white, want to hold on to. And I think we got to get to the root of that. We have to get to the crux of that. It's not an academic topic. It's not. What the Senator Perdue did the other day when he mocked Senator Kamala Harris, that was not accidental. He wanted to remind the audience that she's not like you. She has different parents than you. She's not a 100% American. He didn't say that, but that's what he intimated. And we got to check, folks. And so I don't know how we get to resolution until, as I said, we begin to really interrogate why white folks want to be white.
Well, that is going to have to be the final word. Again, I want to thank Bill. I know you had to go. Darren and Sherry Ann, thank you, all three of you, for your information that you've shared with us today. Very enlightening. I thought it was a very coincidental timeline. It worked really, really well. So thank you for that. And for our attendees, now you do have a break after this, but don't forget to go back to the entrance point so that you can go to the next session that will take place in about, I think it's about 12 o'clock. There's a break between us now. So I hope you enjoyed this. I applaud our presenters. I applaud you, the attendees, for being here. This conversation stops here, but it doesn't stop everywhere. So we must continue to have this discussion. I loved about the co-conspirators. We need to have allies, people who are willing to work with us. I appreciate that. And a friend of mine says we don't need to have safe spaces, we need to have brave spaces. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your conference. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Take good care.
You do the same.